Is anyone not ready? All right. Hi, my name is Vibo, and I affirm resolved. The United States ought to guarantee universal child care. My value for this debate is morality, due to the word ought in the resolution, which implies moral obligation. My standard for this debate is social justice. Social justice seeks acceptance for all, Paris 2018. Social justice is a hypothesis of non-discriminatory relations between an individual and society. Social justice seeks equality, disfavors discrimination, and prioritizes fairness. Social justice helps us work towards celebrating diversity. A society that does not celebrate and acknowledge the differences that we are born with can lead to resentment, hostility, or even worse. Contention one is ableism. Private childcare programs are inaccessible to disabled kids. That also increases economic inequality due to parents quitting their jobs. Novoa 20. Ableism compounds the childcare crisis. Many openings are inaccessible to children with disabilities. Special ed teachers who are paid far below general ed peers, may be especially likely to leave. This, coupled with poor oversight and enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, means children are left out. A larger proportion of parents with disabled children experience difficulty finding care, 34% versus 25%. Parents face scheduling challenges and concerns about quality. These children represent estimated 15% of the United States childhood population and are protected by IDEA, ADA, and Section 504. The ADA and Section 504 define disability broadly. Both prohibit discrimination. Because childcare operate with razor-thin margins that make financing accommodations difficult, children with disabilities are often excluded. Parents of children with disabilities were more likely to report a lack of available slots. These constitute illegal forms of discrimination. Childcare struggles can affect the careers of parents with disabled children. Many leave their job. Inequalities driving parents out of the workforce exacerbate economic inequalities. And a universal childcare system is key to solve ableism. Novoa 20. Fixing the childcare system requires approach such as Working Families Act. In addition to making childcare reliable and affordable for all families, the act includes provisions to ensure high quality. It would increase a supply of accessible care, create intervention services in child settings, and allow providers to fund facilities to improve accessibility. These changes would improve the quality of care to those with disabilities. And ableism justifies discrimination based on socially constructed and artificially created differences. This marginalizes and segregates people deemed different. Collins 13. Ableism perpetuates educational segregation and unequal opportunity. Disability categories have been used to justify oppression, has been used to historically marginalize, segregate, and disempower people marked as different. But the concept of disability has been used to justify discrimination against other groups by attributing disability to them. The marker of disability was called upon to segregate students from groups socially and culturally positioned as different due to perceived ethnicity or status. Contention two is racism. Lack of childcare hurts families of color the most because of systemic racism. Universal childcare is key to combating this. Novoa 20. Broken childcare system is an important issue for parents of color due to occupational and residential segregation. Without action to bolster childcare, parents of color will be forced to choose between putting food on the table and providing children with supervision and enrichment. Lack of childcare undermines ability to recover from pandemic's devastating economic impacts on communities of color. Parents of color were more likely than their white counterparts to experience childcare disruptions. When parents are unable to find childcare, ability to provide for their family suffers. Horrible childcare would deepen racial inequalities. Universal childcare are a powerful tool for achieving racial equity. And racism must be rejected in every instance without surcease. It's a prerequisite to morality. Memi 2000. The struggle against racism will be long, probably never achieved, yet for this reason it is a struggle to be undertaken without surcease. To accept the racist universe to the slightest degree is to endorse fear, injustice, and violence. One cannot found a moral order, let alone a legislative order, on racism, because racism signifies the exclusion of the other and his or her subjection to violence and domination. From an ethical point of view, if one can employ a little religious language, racism is a truly capital sin. Refusal of racism is a condition for all theoretical and practical morality. The ethical choice commands a political one. If this contractual principle is not accepted, then only conflict, violence, and destruction will be our law. Contention 3 is Native Americans. Current federal policies are undermining Native American education. The affirmative early education programs are critical to revitalizing it. Keel 13. Native education programs should prepare students to support children. Family engagement increases achievement. The $1.2 trillion budget reduction is undermining successive early education programs. It equates to 57,000 fewer children served and 18,000 staff members suffering. This is unacceptable. Early education programs are reliant on federal funds. Students who need programs will be left undeserved. Early education bridges the gap. forcing Native people to move from their homelands, compelled the administration to make sure students have access to early education. And education in the status quo forces Native children to give up their identities. Allowing Natives to teach other Natives is key to solve this. Camacho 14. American education has been a source of cultural violence and erase for Native American students, loss of their Indian identities, acquiring mastery over civilized culture, an iron routine, and civilizing machine. Education is linked with acculturation. Mastering the tools of the palefaces, she lost a part of herself. And integrating language and culture education into early childhood education is vital to reinvigorating native language and culture. Grunwald 16. Early childhood language immersion programs reinvigorate language and culture practices. Children who learn their native language and culture have success with education and well being. Thousands of natives were removed from their communities to attend schools that forbade them from speaking their native languages. The language was taken away by force. Uh, for all these reasons, please vote affirmative.
All right. Are you good for cross?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Time starts now. So, let's see. First, on your ableism contention, your argument talks about specifically poor disabled children. How does this relate to like disabled children who are more privileged than others?
Yeah, so it makes an argument as to why, like, just in general, it's not only about poor disabled children. It just makes an argument as to why
It's literally saying that
parents.
like parents will leave the labor force because they can't take care of their children and like work at the same time. Doesn't that only attribute to people with socioeconomic disadvantages?
Right, so it's like before that, it talks about how like these openings for childcare options are like systematically built to exclude people with disabilities and make it so that it's like much harder for them to find childcare.
Okay, so your Collins evidence cites Schweik, Susan Schweik, who literally says like laws and legalism is bad for disabled people, but then you go on to say that the ADA and Rehabilitation Act is good. How is that not a contradiction with the contention?
I mean, like we'll argue that our implementation of the law is good, but also like that's not what the card is talking about. It's just saying like ableism is used to justify
All right,
discrimination of other people.
so how are markers of impairment the root cause of like inferiority, which is what your card's talking about? Like, isn't it just deviance, not disability?
Yeah, we would like that's probably the same thing, but it makes a claim as to why sort of uh like the mark of disability or this sort of idea that they're impaired is the same logic that's used to justify like racism or other forms of discrimination because they're inherently inferior because of some perceived quality.
Cool. Yeah, cool. So on racism, do you give this to white people too?
Sure.
Cool. On natives, what's the terminal impact to coloniality? You didn't read your Maldonado card, so can you tell
I
me?
mean, we would argue that that's a form of racism and racism needs to be rejected. Also, like revitalizing native language and culture is probably
All
a
right.
good thing.
So you take USFG action or like United States action. The United States has broken like every single treaty with Native Americans. How does this specific policy like break that horrible streak?
Yeah, so in the status quo, like childcare for natives is mainly like reservation based or done by native people. So we would argue that the way the plan happens for Native Americans is probably like the U.S. just pays off native people or pays off tribal reservations and gives them like a fat check to like implement it within their own like reservations.
All right. So if white people get access to this, like, all right, actually, so is it the U.S. that's providing childcare, or is it like another
I mean,
entity like tribal company, like tribal governments?
we'll argue that in the situation of Native Americans, because it's already done on tribal reservations, that's how it's going to be implemented
Wait, so the United States gives a check to the natives, and then they use that for childcare?
for universal childcare.
All right, cool. Uh, yeah, and to clarify, you didn't read Maldonado and the feminism contention, right?
Nope.
All right, cool. Well, I'll take prep. Cool. The order will be the neg flow and then the aft flow, but on neg there will be two off case positions, however you want to interpret that. Cool. Is everyone ready? Or better question, is anyone not ready? All right. Cool. Everyone can hear me, right? I negate the at four stated resolution. Contention one is queerness. The affirmative's demand for universal childcare is a demand for heteronormativity. Activities that promote same-sex relations like mocking marriages or kissing games are extremely prevalent throughout childcare and is a vast normalization of gender into heterosexuality. Robinson 5. Heteronormativity in early childhood education is largely rendered invisible to the hegemonic discourses that constitute understandings that reinforces a heterosexual narrative. This process of heterosexualization continues unabated, acknowledged only when children's heterogender constructions seem to slip beyond the norms. This fear is also conveyed by educators who discourage young children's desires for the same sex relations, such as young boys in early children's settings articulating their wish to quote marry their best male friend. Through such transgressions, children learn lessons about what is acceptable and what is intolerable. Mothers and fathers, kissing games, and girls/boyfriends are all examples of normalization of young children. Such heterosexualized activities are seen as to children being children, a natural part of child development. It is important to focus on the construction of gender in early childhood to understand how gender is heterosexualized through heteronormative daily practices. Next, the impact is vast homogenization and overkill. Stanley 1. Overkill is a term used to indicate such excessive violence that it pushes a body beyond death. This heart stops pushing and pulling blood, yet the killing is not finished. Suggests the aim is not simply the end of a specific life, but the ending of all queer life. The utility of violence gives way to the pleasure in the other's mortality. Overkill names the technologies necessary to do with what which is already gone. The queers one day are specters of life whose threat is so unimaginable that one is forced not simply to murder, but to push them backwards out of time, out of history. Overkill, the proper expression, is a proper expression to queer nothingness. Overkill should not be read as individual pathology. Second, contention two is the counterplan. The United States ought to increase funding for childcare teachers, train childcare teachers to teach non-gendered play, reform curriculum to be consistent with the diversity, equality, and inclusion charter and guidelines for early child care education, integrate equity into childcare teachers' wages. This solves the whole act because toddlers are relying on teachers for education, support, etc. Also, this that solves the whole act. It also turns the whole act because not solving for workers literally leaving the industry cannot solve for inequality. Markowitz is 21 writes. Childcare teachers, many of whom are women of color, face conditions that undermine child care and education. Childcare workers make $10 an hour. It is impossible to high quality systems when educators are facing financial challenges. These conditions contribute to high rates of teacher turnover, which have negative implications for young children who benefit from caregivers. The pre pandemic, one third of teachers were not teaching. Turnover rates were much higher in childcare settings, and 46% of childcare teachers left care centers. 56% of childcare teachers were classified as food insecure. 56 reported not having enough money for medical expenses, and red toddler teachers leave at higher rates. Next, amending the racial wage gap is key to creating equality within early childcare and education. Austin et al. 19. African American early educators earn $0.77 less per hour among preschool teachers. This widens to $1.71 per hour. Pay bump for African American educators is $0.96 less per hour. Next steps include building a body of data about racial communities, part of the early care and education workforce. Recognize that people are more than their demographics. Implementing processes that authentically integrate equity for early educators into reforms. Next, the second and third plane solves for the heteronormativity of contention by changing how gender is constructed in childhood education. Vasileva 18. Educators need to examine the materials offered to the children. Educators have the power to engage in expanding children's ways of seeing gender. They can challenge sexism by creating shared stories for boys and girls and by supporting children across traditional gender boundaries. This includes encouraging non-stereotypical play, ensuring equal access to materials, and providing challenging physical activities for boys and girls. The Diversity, Equality, Inclusion Charter for Guidelines for Early Child Care and Education encourages educators to explore gender in childhood settings, to offer children non stereotypical materials, and support opposite sex activities. It emphasizes the need for educators to reflect on their own unconscious gender beliefs. If educators perceive typical play as caused by gender stereotypes, they are more likely to plan such experience in a way that will be inclusive to all children. Educators have the responsibility to respectfully challenge any stereotypes expressed by both children and adults. Adequate and universal support to educators is required if they are to translate policy into practice and meet the needs of children in their care who want or need to extend their gender discourses into play. Educators need to be aware of the gender issues in early childhood. Next, the counterplan's act of challenging the curriculum away from heteronormativity is a process of queerifying gender. Only by changing what teachers teach can we change the process of normalization. Robinson 5. Any examination of construction of gender in young children's lives needs to focus on how gender heterosexualization operates, including those in education. Experience as a retributions for each transgression becomes a powerful lesson in which children learn what is acceptable. This brings into view the importance of educators examining their own positions, children, and sexuality, and the impacts they can have on children. Next, let's move on to the AF case. First, on framing. I will concede their framing, but heteronormativity must outweigh under their framework. I will do that impact calculus later. On the first, but also counterplan solves all of their impacts. The teachers' equity and increasing funding for teachers allows for more engagement in students. Next, under ableism contention, solving back for heteronormativity vastly solves for ableism and as a result of normalization practices in spaces of childhood education, something their own impact evidence concedes to being a good thing. Also, any risk of heteronormativity is a massive turns case to this contention since they reify normalization practices. Also, reject their impact evidence is deviance, not impairment. Next to Dranji and Taylor 20 evidence on the next contention is also direct refutation to his contention, as this is talking about less privileged disabled people. On their racism contention, universal childcare will only lead to the segregation of services for those with privileges. Multiple Rollins, Dranji, and Telly 20, right? We have studied a system that is designed to provide uniform and high quality childcare for all children. We describe excessive segregation of children by socioeconomic background across centers, take advantage of their discretion by enrolling more advantaged children, and excessive segregation of children by socioeconomic background stems from parental application behavior. Advantaged parents have better access to networks. Policymakers may want to take measures to secure opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Universal childcare may not be able to fully counteract inequalities unless deliberate action is taken. Under natives of tension, cross-applied to the evidence we just read. Cross-applied evidence we just read. Also, every treaty and every agreement with natives has been broken since day one. Make them explain why the app won't be circumvented in this specific instance. Also, they didn't read a terminal impact to this argument. And also, note the term American Indian is incredibly disrespectful, and it's what the colonizer called indigenous people. It's another reason why this policy and the way you have presented it is disingenuous and probably gets circumvented. And I didn't read the last card.
All right, are you ready?
Hold up. Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. All right. So in your first contention about heteronormativity, you talk about how like children play like kissing games. How does like children doing something, how is that a fault of like the childcare system?
It's like the childcare system that teaches like the girlfriend boyfriend binary, or like the mock marriages. Like, I'm sure when you were in daycare, childcare teachers taught you that was the right thing to do, or
No, wait,
like
wait.
y'all
So
did that.
so teachers are the ones telling kids like, oh, go
Yeah,
kiss
they're
this
like
girl.
teaching this form of play. Like,
Okay. Um, what is like overkill? Like, can you explain?
the Stanley evidence is that it's a state in which you are beyond death, like you are mutilated, your heart stops pumping, but at the same time, it's not. It's still pumping. Like
What does
you're,
that mean?
like, it's pretty much like, you know how people say like I'm living a life like hell on earth. That's pretty much what it is, like hell on earth.
Okay. All right, let's go to the counterplan. So is the counterplan text? The counterplan text is just increase funding for teachers and then train them according to this bill, right? And then teach them like
Yeah,
non-gendered play.
yeah, sure. That's one of the
All
planks.
right, where did the racial wage gap stuff come in?
It's
I
just
don't
saying
think that
that
was a plank of the
it's
counterplan.
the plank. It says integrate equity into childcare teachers' wages.
Integrate equity. Okay. Um, your evidence doesn't say that. It's like your evidence says that like we need to like build a database and things like that. Like that's just
It's
like
our
not
evidence
what your
says
evidence
that
says.
a racial wage gap exists and is what's causing like specific people of color and for early educators like getting out of the system or being kicked out of the system or just leaving the system. We're saying that resolving that would keep teachers in the system, which is key to solving your impacts and avoiding all of the heteronormativity stuff.
All right. Let's go to the case answers. So, the evidence you read on our racism contention, I think like drag. I don't know what the author is. Like how like is it just saying like in a universal childcare system, like white rich parents manipulate the system, or like what happens?
It's saying that services will be segregated because one, we live in a pretty racist country and I will do that in the first place. But two, it's saying that like parent like even if it's universal, that's just masking for the fact that it'll still be really hard to navigate for people with disadvantages, and then people with more networking and people who can apply their networks onto like their children, and this universal system will benefit more from it. And we have specific empirics from Norway.
Okay. Um. um, All right. How does queerifying gender, like, how does a counterplan solve the app? Like the entirety of the app?
I mean, first of all, it solves the entirety of the app because by letting teachers into the system and like funding them, it allows the children to make meaningful
How does
relationships
it
with
solve
teachers.
like native language being lost?
I mean, it solves teachers like teaching that in the first place, but also we would say you don't solve that because it's super disingenuous.
Okay. I'll take prep. All right, that was 120. It'll be the AF case, so contention one, contention two, contention three, the counterplan, and then the uh, queerness contention.
Wait, so it'll be contention two and contention one.
Yeah.
All right, I'm good.
Let's start on contention one. We've made a claim that childcare in the status quo is inaccessible to disabled kids and parents with disabled kids. All they said is that heteronormativity should outweigh, or heteronormativity should control ableism, but specifically extend our evidence that tells you that the reason why like sort of heteronormativity is the norm, or the reason why heterosexual people are punished, is because disability or deviance is marked onto their bodies because of this perceived quality that makes them inferior. That's the exact same logic of disability, which means which means it's the other way around, which is that ableism should control the internal link to like heteronormativity. That's the only argument they made. So let's go on to contention two. They read this evidence that says that universal childcare would lead to segregation of services. However, force them to read evidence that is like specific to how the US works. They've read this evidence from like Norway that like does not apply to the US, but also like make them prove that like the Norway system is what is going to be implemented in the US. But also their evidence only talks about people from like socioeconomic backgrounds or people with less socioeconomic stats, which does not equate to like race, which means they can't conflate those things. And that means that's not a reason why we can't solve. But also it says that if we do universal childcare without sort of like supplementing that, like that's bad. But specifically, evidence talks about how universal childcare would be supplemented with things like to solve racism and include checks to check back against things like this, which means we can definitely solve. Um, Let's go on to contention three about Native Americans. They'll cross-apply their evidence here, but no, the cross-application doesn't work for one key reason, which is that it only happens on reservations. This was what we said in the very first cross, which was that in the status quo, childcare happens on tribes by tribes, which means there's no white people or rich people manipulating the system because it is completely run by tribal governments, which means the only people involved are Native people, which means like white people cannot manipulate the system because they're just not involved in it. Next, they said that the U.S. U.S. federal government like breaks every tree, force them to prove why our specific application of the law is bad, but also like the U.S. federal government giving Native Americans funds to have universal child care on reservations is not a reason. Like that's definitely not bad. Uh, like it's literally run by tribal governments, which means like they cannot conflate that with the U.S. government. Um, Next, they select the word the word American Indian is bad. However, focus on the political correctness of terms for Indigenous peoples distracts the conversation from self-determination and creating a political world where Indigenous identity isn't in the hands of the colonizer. Jericho 98. Concern for political correctness focuses more on appearances than reality. They change our names and treat us the same. Some of their real names are not actually derived from the people themselves, but from their neighbors or even enemies. To not get hung up on the names for the sake of political correctness. It may be that the shortest way to penetrate the situation of Indigenous people is to critically use a generic name imposed upon them. We aim for a critical awareness of nation and homelands, of Indigenous self-determination. This card says that trying to call us out or trying to nitpick with the words we say is actually bad and actually creates more colonization or colonialism. Now let's move on to the next case. First on contention 2. The counterplan just does not solve the app. It cannot solve for native language being taken away from them, native culture being taken away from them. Even if they can somehow bring teachers back into the system, if there is no universal childcare, those teachers will be useless because like disabled kids cannot have access to them, or people of color cannot have access to them, or Native Americans cannot have access to them, which means it does not solve the app. But also the permutation, it's definitely not competitive. They'll say we link to the dissat, but I'll do that analysis on the dissat. It is definitely not competitive at all. The permutation do both do the app and increase funding for teachers, integrate equity and whatever else the counterplan is. Now let's go on to the disad. First is that the permutation should resolve all of it. Even if there's some chance that we link to the disad, the permutation should resolve it especially because it's just not competitive with the app and it's not mutually exclusive. But also there's just not really a link because their evidence only talks about how children like in childcare systems do these things like kissing games or like do these things where they set up boys and girls to kiss each other. That's not a fault of the childcare system. That's like just what children do. So they cannot put that blame on the childcare system.
Cool. I'll take prep. Time starts now. All right. The order will be the counter plan, like contention two on the next side, contention two, contention one. On F, it'll just be like top down. Wait, hold up, my word crashed. Sorry. Cool. Time. Oh, sorry. Time starts. Now, first on the current plan, we're kicking and we're not going to go for it. We'll concede to the permutation duo to this round. It pretty much resolves the leads. We're not going for the counter plan. Like, it's just a test of competition. It's just a test of competition. It doesn't gain them offense in this round. Meaning that I'm not going for this counter plan in the first place. We're going for the DA in this round. First, as an overview to the DA, our argument is that the affirmative participates in a process of vast homogenization. Spaces of childcare participate in forms of play and education that teaches children that being heterosexual is normal and the only thing that is tolerable. Mock marriages and the boyfriend girlfriend dynamic that is taught is a perfect example of this. The F links super hard into this by guaranteeing everyone access to the status quo form of childhood education. The impact is overkill. Explain Stanley 1 that says that it is a state of being beyond that. Your heart still pumps, but your heart still pumps, but you are still mutilated. That's good. And it's like hell on earth, which definitely outweighs. I'll do the impact calculus here. First, it outweighs all of the arguments because of the normalization root cause argument that we've made here. We have made an argument as to why all of the affirmative impacts and all impacts of oppression are predicated upon normalization practices in the first place. That is predicated upon a notion of being queer, a notion of being outside of the norm, a notion of being intolerable. That is the definition of queer, something that does not fit into the social order or in the social norms, which proves that we are definitely winning a root cause claim. We'll answer the specific arguments on the AF case, but this is a specific root cause claim that outweighs the entirety of affirmative, proves that we are a prior question to evaluate all of their offense, all of their impacts, because you must resolve forms of normalization. In the first place, normalization is what causes all of these forms of inferiority because it makes one norm, the white conservative liberal, no, the white conservative person, that white, and all of those things, that all of those things are examples of as to why anything that doesn't fit that paradigm undergoes normalization, which proves that normalization is definitely the root cause of their specific impacts of racism, like racism against natives and ableism, things like that, are all predicated on normalization. But also overkill definitely always all their arguments. The Stanley one evidence is good on the question as to how, if you are genderqueer, then if you are genderqueer, you're subject to overkill. You're living on a hell on earth, and you are mutilated, and you're mutilated, and your heart circulates blood. Your heart still pumps, but your heart doesn't circulate, doesn't push blood in the first place. All of those things, and that's also a metaphor for how queer people have to live in a hell on earth in the first place, and how when they don't fit into the social order, they pretty much cannot participate in the delicacies of life in the first place. Which is that overkill definitely always all of your arguments are definitely overkill definitely always all of your arguments. It's the only terminal impact. All of your arguments are about are in the abstract, like epistemic impacts about how like racism is bad for the moral and legislative order, as to how, or like ableism reifies epistemic segregation. But that's not overkill. Is a specific material impact that definitely outweighs, and we have an internal link to this impact in this round because we have specifically proven to you that when children are taught, when children are normalized, and when children are normalized, those who are not queer are specifically excluded in spaces of childcare. They undergo this form of overkill starting from day one in childcare, which proves that there we definitely have an internal link in this argument, and it definitely outweighs all of their arguments. And it definitely outweighs all of their arguments. I'll line violating your first specific argument. First, you say permutation resolves this, but no, we have conceded to the permutation in this round, meaning that this argument literally doesn't matter. Next, you say that this is not what the apps does. This is what children do. But no, first, this is a vast homogenization of what children do. There are definitely queer children who don't do this in the first place, and you have just homogenized it by making this argument, which is another link into this DA, and which is another link into this DA, but also, which is another link to this DA, but also this is a specific argument as to how this is a specific argument as to how current childhood education is like this, and why you guarantee universal childhood education is like this. Here's the link spin, which is that you guarantee universal childhood education allows everyone to enter this paradigm of universal childhood education, and those who are genderqueer will be normalizing these practices in the first place. Teachers specifically teach things like mock marriages, boyfriend, girlfriend. I'm sure everyone has experienced that in daycare in the first place, and those people will always be normalized, which proves that there's definitely a link here. And sure, the kissing is what kids do in the first place, but the boyfriend girlfriend dynamic or the mock marriages are definitely things that teachers teach, not what kids do naturally, not what kids do naturally, which proves that it's an educational system that is doing this. But also, this is a no link argument, meaning that this is just a no link argument and definitely not terminal defense on our link argument, which proves that you should feel very uncomfortable voting solely off of this argument on their case. First on the ableism stuff, I'll explain. First on the ableism stuff, I'll explain if we win any risk of the root cause claim by answering this deviance argument, then you could feel comfortable voting negative because it proves that any risk of bullying turns this specific contention. First, the deviance argument, the only argument you make here is that deviance is marked onto other bodies because of the pure body or something, but you have defined disability as impairment in this round. The way you have the way you have represented disability and the way you have presented your case in this round, but the deviance is not marked by impairment. Deviance is marked by queerness because the way we have defined queerness is something that is outside of the social order, which is a broader concept of deviance, which proves that we are definitely the root cause of disability isn't. Also, your impact card only talks about markers of inferiority, which means that you can only explain forms of epistemic violence that you cannot explain, but you cannot explain forms of material violence like what we were talking about, or all of your other impacts, which proves that your impact card is super bad on this question. Next, on the racism contention, we're going for this derogatory piece of evidence that should take out the entirety of argument, extend it. It literally says that a universal childcare will suck because it is universal, and white people rich people will always have more access to these resources. Even if it's universal, it ignores how universal childcare will be complex to navigate, and parents with application resources will be able to navigate it better and allow more services for their children. You're allow more certainty to the children, which literally turns this racism contention every single other contention because it decks accessibility to the system. I'll line your specific arguments. You say that it's about Norway, but no, this is contextualized to the United States. There's things like segregation, which is definitely unique to the United States and USFG. Actually, you say that it's about socioeconomic stuff, but there's a little something called white privilege that proves that says that white people have more privilege in terms of the socioeconomic matter, which proves socioeconomic matter, which means that this still links specifically to racism. You say universal childcare is targeted, but it's definitely not targeted. Universal means everyone has access to, including rich white people, which proves that you still link to this argument. Lastly, on the natives contention, like you can just cross apply that argument.
All right, I'll take the rest of my part.
I'll be right back.
All right. It'll be contention 1, contention 3, and then the dissent.
All right.
Okay. Anyone not ready? All right. They functionally conceded our ableism argument. They've conceded the links. They conceded the internal links. They've conceded that universal childcare solves ableism. All we have to do is beat back the dissat or prove that ableism is the root cause of queer or of like heteronormativity, and we win this round. Let's do the line by line for first. That they say that we've defined disability as impairment, but no, we haven't. We've repeatedly said throughout this round that disability is deviant. Anything that deviates from the social norm, or anything that deviates from the norm, is defined as disability, which we've literally said throughout this round. We haven't said it's only impairment. But even if it is impairment, then the logic of impairment is applied onto queer bodies because queer bodies are seen as impaired because they are queer, which is the logic of disability, which means we become the starting point to answer how or to deconstruct heteronormativity or answer how heteronormativity operates, which means since we control the root cause or we control the internal link to the dissets impacts, you can very, very easily vote F here because we are winning this root cause debate. That was all the answers they made. I'm kicking their racism contention. I will concede their evidence is only terminal defense. It doesn't get them any offense in this round because at best they can prove that the affirmative is just as bad as the status quo, which only proves defense, terminal defense, not that it's not offense. Now let's go on to contention 3. The only argument they extend is that they'll cross apply their evidence, but we'll specifically extend that it doesn't cross apply or the cross application doesn't work because it is done by tribes on native lands or done on reservations, which is completely different uh, than the U.S. federal government doing it. The U.S. federal government supplying it because it is it is tribal governments doing it. It is native people teaching other native people, which definitely means that it doesn't apply. There can't do the cross application because white people just aren't involved in the system to begin with, which means, yeah, they didn't answer that. Uh, yeah, and they functionally conceded the entirety of the third contention too, which is that early childhood programs native education is being sabotaged by current federal policies, and that undermines native language and culture. The only way to resolve that is by universal childcare to guarantee early childhood education. Now let's move on to the dissent. Um, First, we'll go for a no link argument. At best, they can prove that some teachers teach these things. Like they cannot prove that this is a fault of the childcare system. At best, they can prove there are some rich white conservative teachers that teach kids that it's good to be straight. They teach kids how to be a good straight kid, but they cannot put that fault on the childcare system. At best, they can prove that like education is bad, or they can prove that some teachers are bad in certain areas. Like they cannot prove that childcare as a whole is bad. Also, we're completely winning the root cause debate here because we are crossed by what I said on the first contention, which is that any sort of deviance or any sort of impairment, which is what queer people are, queer people are impaired because of their queerness, is the logic of disability, which means we are controlling the root cause. Next, say that we homogenize all children doing things, but no, our argument was that they said that some children like play kissing games or some children want boyfriends and girlfriends or want like opposite sex significant others or whatever, right? We've said that some children do that, and children doing that is not a fault of this childcare system, which is another no link argument. Finally, they said overkill outweighs, but no, we're controlling the internal link to why queer overkill happens in the first place. But also, overkill is obviously not a material impact because obviously your heart is not stopping. Your heart is not like actually materially not pumping blood. It's an epistemic impact that we control the internal link to.
Cool.